I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and speak to the Customs and Excise Tobacco Products Budget Measures Amendment Bill and 6 others. We will be supporting these bills. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's important to point out the overall ambition of these bills, and that is ultimately smoking cessation, as we understand it. It's an increase in excise that is intended ultimately to have some public health good. There's an estimate, though, that this legislation will raise an additional, as I understand it, $528 million over 4 years. But I think it is important to clarify that, at least on this side of the House, it is the public health measures, the public good that is done by trying to reduce smoking amongst our communities, and that is what drives our support ultimately for this bill and these bills. But is that what's driving the national government when it comes to their support of this bill? And I think probably the easiest way to give us some sense of what is motivating them and driving them on these matters is voting record. That usually is indicative of where a political party's, you can say ideological views or you can say values, stand on these matters. Now, when we look at Labor's history and record when it comes to smoking and smoking cessation, I think it's a record that we can certainly stand with some pride on. And that is because, of course, not only did we focus on excise as a way to address the issue, but we also looked at how you create culture change. And I think that one of the most significant moves in that regard was the legislation that was pursued and defended and rigorously developed by Steve Chadwick. That was, I remember at the time, extraordinarily controversial, the idea of removing the ability to smoke in bars and restaurants. And it certainly came under heavy scrutiny externally from those in industry, obviously, but also some in the hospitality industry. There was a view that it would bring down tourism, hospitality, all sorts of messages were thrown around. But because our main driver was the public good and the public health good of these measures, we pursued them with vigour. And obviously there was always risk attached when you do pursue such matters in that way, but it was the right thing to do. And I do believe it has made a significant difference. I've got nothing more than my anecdote and experience to say I think it's made one of the most significant differences in recent times to shifting our culture, to shifting whether or not the amount, certainly, that people are smoking, but overall to try and move us closer to a smoke-free New Zealand. It is estimated that half of all long-term smokers die of a smoking-related illness, and about 5,000 deaths each year in New Zealand are directly attributable to smoking or second-hand smoke. It is unlike any other substance almost that we regulate in New Zealand because we know of its dire consequences. That does give it a slight difference than alcohol, but I will come back to that point. But if we look at National's record on these matters, we took extraordinary urgency to increase excise on tobacco in May 2000, and Bill English, well, the National Party voted against those measures, but Bill English specifically said, when defending his reasoning for not having voted for those measures, he said, the reason we voted against this measure was that the government did not ever say that it would do it, and that is the measure it set, not us. The government did not say before the election that it would do it. That is the government's standard, not ours. It is a tax increase. It is a tax on the poorest people in New Zealand. It is an increase that is far too large, and that is why we voted against it. I want to try a little experiment here. Let's pretend that instead of this being a quote about excise tax increase on cigarettes, and instead of this being a quote given by a National Party member, let's turn it into a quote about GST increases. And let's turn it into something said potentially by a member of the opposition. I think you'd find that probably would hold. The government did not say before the election that it would do it. It is a tax increase. It is a tax on the poorest people in New Zealand. It is an increase that is far too large. I think that would have been a much more fitting quote from the national government's increase in GST than it would have on an increase in excise around tobacco. And when it comes to increases in excise, an interesting point, are those things that one campaigns on? Well, there's a reason why excise often, and in many forms, is debated under urgency, often. Last year's sherry taxes, alcohol taxes, there's a reason. Because you try not to encourage the enormous uptake of purchasing before you move an excise in a particular direction. It's a really practical reason. Interesting, I think, that Bill English has, though, exposed at that time, and perhaps even now, where the national government sits on these issues. Is it a tax grab? I'd like to be slightly more generous than that. But one thing I do know is that I have absolutely no doubt that the Māori Party have made a significant difference to the national government's positioning on smoking. They absolutely have, and credit where credit is due. If Tariana Turia in particular was not driving this agenda on that side of the House, I doubt we would have seen the measures that we have seen. Certainly, plain packaging of cigarettes is an issue that Tony Ryle was very dismissive of, very dismissive. And I think you pull out the record of that government on issues like that, it certainly exposes not only their lack of commitment overall, but the difference that a coalition partner has made. But one of the questions I want to ask is, if we know that higher prices are one of the most effective tobacco control measures that we have, can we transfer over that reasoning and rationale to the debate around alcohol? Because they are both substances that there are known harms associated with, obviously in cigarettes, from the first smoke to the 10th smoke there's harm. Whereas alcohol, we are debating questions often of moderation. But you could argue there's immediate harm depending on your age and your station and so on, and depending on who's consuming. So why then are we not having the same discussion around the difference that price points make for alcohol? Well, there's only one reason why we're not having that debate, because the government doesn't want us to have that debate, and we should be having it. If the alcohol legislation that the government's bringing before this House is the substantive opportunity that we have in this lifetime to change this nation's culture around alcohol, as with smoking, price should have at least been part of the discussion. It should have at least been debated. The idea that we need to collect more data, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid just doesn't hold. But I want to acknowledge how far we have moved in this debate. How far even in my generation. But I recall when I was at school, for instance, that my basketball coach, I did at some point engage in team sports. This is something that would be known to be unusual for anyone who knows me. My basketball coach told me that at one period during his life, his doctor had prescribed him cigarette smoking as a way to deal with with anxiety issues. Prescribed cigarette smoking. And that was my high school teacher. We have moved. We have come a long way. But we must make sure that we don't lose our drive around dealing with this significant issue. The one final thing I wish to say, Mr. Speaker, we are dealing with CPI adjustment in this bill in a piecemeal way. Labor believes the government needs to undertake a review of the CPI and how it is used to index government payments and revenue rather than fiddling with it in an ad hoc and potentially discriminatory way. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased we're seeing a little more proactivity at this point, and I hope we see a lot more.
I call David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is a good bill which it's important